Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so most of us have heard by now that Joe Rogan on Saturday found himself in the White House standing behind Trump doing this executive order signing stunt about ibogaine and other psychedelic drug treatments that people have been advocating to loosen restrictions on research for a long time. So that's what this executive order is supposedly supposed to do. And Joe Rogan was one of the many people standing in this silly looking ensemble behind Trump as he signed this executive order. So we're getting a decent amount of stunts from Trump lately as this Iran war thing goes on. And, you know, having Rogan stand with him for an executive order signing like this, with the backdrop of the Iran war happening, given that that's something Rogan has criticized Trump for, although mildly, that is a strong piece of propaganda. So we shouldn't overlook that Rogan is helping Trump propagandize by showing up for this, even if it is an issue that Rogan has been relatively consistent on. So I'll get to all that in a second, but here is a clip of Trump doing this signing in the Oval Office and him and Rogan kind of glazing each other. So here's that.
Joe Rogan is a fantastic person. We did a little interview before the election. We had over 300 million people. And I said, oh man, I hope Kamala doesn't do it. And she didn't. He wanted her to do it, but she didn't. Someday Joe's going to explain why. I could tell you why. But along with many other, because she didn't want to, with many other veterans. And I just want to thank the people behind me are outstanding. It's an amazing group. The executive order I'm signing, we're actually signing the executive order today, is really a moment. It directs the FDA to expedite their review of certain psychedelics already designated as breakthrough therapy drugs. They're very much being discussed. It's one of the hottest things I think you're talking about, Oz, right?
I want to tell everybody how this happened. I sent President Trump some information. We have a gigantic opiate problem in this country, obviously. In 2024, more than 80,000 people died of overdoses. It's a horrible number. And there's more than 5 million people that are addicted to opiates right now in this country. With one dose of ibogaine, more than 80% of people are free of that addiction. With 2 doses, it's more than 90%. I sent him that information. The text message came back, sounds great. Do you want FDA approval? Let's do it. It was literally that quick. These drugs are illegal not because they're harmful. They're illegal because of the 1970 Controlled Substances Act that was passed by the Richard Nixon administration. They did it to target the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. It's not because these drugs harm people. And for 56 years, we've lived under those terrible conditions. We're free of that now. We're free of that now. Thanks to all these people that you see next to me, and thanks to President Trump.
Okay, so very uncomfortable scene here. Rogan looks quite uncomfortable. There's also a part earlier where RFK Jr. is talking and he is just like shaking and trembling and jerking. He's like the picture of health, in other words. The whole thing is just kind of surreal to watch. Rogan looks a little uncomfortable, but also clearly wants to be here. He clearly feels strongly about this, and it's honestly not surprising that he is at the White House for this specific cause. Ibogaine is something he's talked about for a long time. It is a substance that there's been a concerted push to relieve some of the restrictions around it. AOC is another politician who has singularly pushed to loosen some of this regulation. So in other words, this is an example of Trump outflanking something that should be a Democratic and left-wing issue. So it's not that surprising to find Rogan there, even though he's not left-leaning anymore. This is one of the only things that has been a consistent political issue of Rogan since the beginning of his show, is stuff about psychedelics and wanting to use it more for treatments. So overall, I think this is a good thing. And I've seen a couple people missing it a little bit by saying, oh, this is like ivermectin style Joe Rogan stuff, which you can frame it that way, yeah, but truthfully, this is something that stands to benefit humanity. At least a lot more research needs to be done into how these psychedelic drugs affect people and how they can affect people rebuilding their synapses after significant traumas, PTSD, etc. And because they're so heavily restricted and regulated, it's impossible to do that research to even know how effective these substances can be. So this is purely political opportunism on the part of Joe Rogan, and we now can see why he has been playing it a little safer in his criticisms of Trump. And that's another thing that I see people missing the ball on, is they've been saying Rogan's turning on Trump, Rogan's criticizing Trump, Rogan's upset at Trump. None of that is true. In fact, Rogan has been pretty consistently reminding his audience about what the pro-Trump narrative is throughout this time where people are turning on him, and Rogan has been levying some criticisms of him, of the Iran war, of him on the Epstein stuff. Mostly what he says about it is that it looks bad. It's a bad look, and that some people in the base are having a hard time with this. That's mostly what he said when it comes to ICE, the war, etc. And he's criticized him the most harshly when it comes to his actions in Iran, which again, very interesting timing that while that's still going on, Rogan shows up behind him, because this would have been a little bit less out of place a few months before, but it shows that the relationship that they've kind of hinted at having, Trump has said that he speaks on the phone with Rogan. Rogan says here that he texts Trump some information about ibogaine, and then Trump's like, what, you want FDA approval? Let's do it. So that's the type of relationship he's established with Trump. And it's clear that even though he is differing from him on some things and clearly sees that some key parts of the voices of the Trump base are starting to move away from him, and yet he still wants to maintain a kind of relationship where he can shoot some stuff over to him and maybe even get a response. And something to be clear about is that this is a moment when Trump specifically has something to gain from Rogan, because Rogan talking about Trump in a positive way, not being too hard on him about this war stuff, which again, he has not been. That's something that's very useful to Trump right now, especially showing up and backing him in this way. So while this is, like I said, a pretty classic Rogan issue, this is not some kind of left field right-winger shit that Joe Rogan is supporting Trump signing, although there's plenty of that as well. But this is pretty much Joe Rogan's brand. However, this is him clearly showing that and this limited political win, it's unclear how successful this is actually going to be, is more important to him than the obviously much bigger picture things that are currently happening in America, which Rogan talks about with regularity, about how we're seeing power consolidating and the implications of this type of military imperialism. Rogan does bring those type of things up, so he sees it happening, and yet views Trump as an opportunity to get some things through that wouldn't get through under any other circumstances. And that is true about Trump. And so in a way, I don't blame him for using the opportunity while it's there. However, it's true that Rogan is also being used in exchange to help Trump in this very crucial moment where he's looking very bad with his base. And the thing that's interesting about that is that Rogan now is more behind Trump than a lot of other diehard MAGA voices that have at least rhetorically turned on Trump because they feel it's convenient, because they feel like it's impossible for them to continue speaking to their audience and justifying what Trump is doing. So Rogan is in some ways justifying the Trump narrative better than people like Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, and Alex Jones, who is now also doing an anti-Trump arc. And the interesting thing, I think the headline here with Rogan is not so much, oh, he stood behind Trump on this thing, because it's pretty expected that this would be something that Rogan would back. But rather, I think we're starting to see a clearer picture of the types of relationships that Rogan has. He has regular contacts with incredibly powerful people. Trump, Peter Thiel, other billionaires that we don't know about. I think former and current government employees are in regular contact with Rogan. So he's establishing a sort of anti-immigration, pro-capitalist, anti-state investment. He still says that he's pro-social safety net, but then he gets really, really hung up on the idea of immigrants supposedly getting access to that social safety net. Even though that's negligible, they contribute more to the social safety net than they get out of it in America. But that's the narrative that Rogan is coalescing around as being like the boogeyman. We have the hordes coming into America through immigration. Who knows where they're coming from? They're being masterminded by Democrats to come and change America and take it away from the red-blooded Republicans. And Rogan hasn't gone as far as white nationalism yet, but it pretty much borders on the same thing. And I mean, he's been laundering that theory for long enough at this point that he is essentially bears some responsibility for it. And all of this is in favor of maintaining a network that Rogan feels like will serve his interests and also allow him to maintain relevance. And it's also just the political bet that he's making. He thinks this is the future, the Peter Thiels and the Trumps of the world. So he's backing Trump, and the rest of the commentariat on the right is moving away from Trump and not able to justify this and not finding opportunities for political wins within it. Tim Dillon, Theo Vaughn, Andrew Schultz are all turning away from Trump much more harshly than Rogan is. And that's just an interesting emerging trend, because at some points, all three of those dudes said things that were further right than what Rogan is known for saying. But as I've been pointing out, the underlying ideology that Rogan has is not actually changing. And if anything, it is solidifying around a pretty out there right-wing viewpoint of the world. And the same is true for most of these other guys on the right to varying degrees, but I think that lack of any reconsideration of any of his thoughts on the past several years in America is the reason that Rogan still mostly supports Trump, even though he's mildly critical of him in some instances. And so here, just as a contrast, an interesting contrast, is a clip of Tucker Carlson talking to his brother, Buckley Carlson, who's really just like a less charismatic version of Tucker Carlson. He's kind of like the Waluigi of Tucker Carlson. And so he's talking to him, and he says that he is ashamed that he supported Trump, that it'll torment him for a long time, and that he's sorry for misleading people. So here's Tucker Carlson saying that. Very short clip.
You and I and everyone else who supported him, you wrote speeches for him, I campaigned for him. I mean, we're implicated in this for sure.
Yes.
It's not enough to say, well, I changed my mind, or like, oh, this is bad, I'm out. It's like in very small ways, but in real ways, you and me and millions of people like us are the reason this is happening right now.
Yes.
So I do think it's like a moment to wrestle with our own consciences. We'll be tormented by it for a long time. I will be. And I want to say I'm sorry for misleading people. It was not intentional. That's all I'll say. But anyway, the question does present itself immediately, like, what is this? Was this always the plan? You don't want to be a conspiracy nut, but like clearly there were signs of low character. We knew that.
So Tucker is very performative. I don't really buy this act. I think there's some earnestness to it, but I think it's mostly that he views this as the right thing to say at this moment. It's just very interesting that Tucker Carlson seems to consistently be seeing the opening that is being left, not just by people on the right, but people on the left as well, and filling that space. So he sees that what these other guys who promoted Trump are not saying right now is, fuck, I'm really sorry I promoted that guy, I regret it. That's the right thing for them to be saying. And in all these instances where they're starting to kick their feet and do the aw shucks routine, they're not going quite as far as saying, I really fucked up promoting this. They're still being defensive about it. They're still arguing for Trump a little bit. And like I said with Rogan, he hasn't even really backed off of it. So Tucker has now outflanked everybody when it comes to reversing course on Trump. I'm not sure what the end goal of that is. I think he's trying to carve out a political rhetoric of his own and possibly a run in the future. But it's interesting that you see Tucker Carlson grasping for some influence with Trump, getting shut out. That's almost certainly the reason that he has turned on Trump so hard, is because he got turned out by Trump pretty hard. And Rogan, at the same time, is being welcomed in and having a pretty fruitful relationship with Trump. And so it shows that it's kind of just like this rotating door that doesn't always have that much logic to it. It doesn't make that much sense that Rogan is the one backing Trump in this moment versus Tucker Carlson. But opportunism would have it be that way, and that's just a result of the sort of pinwheel governing approach of Trump, where it's like whatever happens to get his attention. So all kinds of people have access to Trump in the way that he describes Rogan having access to him. The ability to just text him or call him about some random shit. And if that that person has enough leverage with Trump, then he might just be like, okay, yeah, let's do that. And the ability to throw his weight around like he was describing at the FDA and say, we're just going to do this. And at another point, he looks at another guy and he says, you're going to do the descheduling, right? He says, Joe, they're slow walking me on descheduling. So he's trying to throw his weight around, and this whole thing of Rogan texting him and him saying, what do you want? FDA approval? Let's do it. I mean, that's kind of fucking insane. And while on one hand, we can definitely say, and the liberals are definitely going to take the stance of, that's not how a president should be conducting these type of presidentially matters, and the FDA is important. And it's true that this drug is dangerous, ibogaine. I don't want to downplay that, by the way. There are some serious risks to it. That's why it needs to be studied more. It's definitely not ready to be taken by masses of people. But this thing about Trump just saying, we're just going to do this at the FDA. And again, it's not just putting something on the market, which is something you can see the Trump administration doing, but this is more so going for trials and stuff. Now, it's hard for me to imagine how they're going to find much money for that when they are cutting money for research left and right. It seems like this might just end up getting tangled up and not going anywhere, and again, getting slow walked on scheduling and not really lead to very much, in which case Rogan will have lent his credibility to Trump for this over nothing. That's probably the most likely outcome here, is that this isn't really going to go anywhere, because while Trump is able to throw his weight around significantly more than other presidents have been willing to try to do, he's quickly losing his ability to do that. He's losing steam because more and more of these executive orders are getting challenged and thrown out in court, and his ability to actually do these things is being tested. But at the same time, he has built up an enormous amount of political capital over the years as his first administration went down, and then as backing him was a winning bet in 2024, he even had more political leverage to do things like this and set up the FDA in a way that he can demand them do certain things and have the gears turn a little bit faster. So the truth is, I would like to see someone on the left governing in this same way. And that's why I say this is Trump outflanking on an issue that should belong to the left and should belong squarely to the Democrats. And what Rogan says there about it, about how it was used to target the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement, that's 100% true. And allowing Trump to have that political win at this moment, even if it is flimsy or fake, it is an abdication. This is something that Biden could have done, and it came up a couple times during Biden's administration, and they never go anywhere with it because it's red tape, and then they just don't feel like putting the political capital into it. So that's what this is going to take too. If Rogan really wants to see this going somewhere, he's going to have to stay in Trump's ear, which means he's going to have to stay on Trump's side and continue this relationship that he has with Trump. So some of these other guys who are on the outside are finding it really hard to continue caping for him, but Rogan is not. Rogan sees exactly the argument that Trump's people need to be making, and also sees the argument that is beginning to weaken the base, and is trying to thread the needle so that he can maintain his credibility and not piss off Trump. So far, it's working. I think that's going to ultimately shred his credibility, because these other rats are jumping ship, because they have a sense that even if some of this stuff that Trump is doing now works out okay, the political project of Trump is done. And unless somebody carves out a new path forward, it's going to leave the right with nothing, especially if the left-wing movement to take over government in a strong way is successful. So that seems like the inevitable trend at this point, because Trump is fucking up so hard, and you're gonna see Rogan be one of the strongest voices advocating for Trump going into these midterms, and you can quote me on that.